and then why is this still important today? Why are we still talking about this more than 75 years later? So I'll kind of get into that history. I'll introduce myself before I get started. So my name is Nina. I am I'm also the communications coordinator at Densho. So some of you might be familiar with Densho already, but if you're not, basically we are a digital history organization. We have the biggest online collection of personal items from Japanese Americans related to the incarceration during World War II. So we have, I think we're up to about 950 oral history interviews with survivors of the camps, and then about over 70,000 photos, letters, newspaper articles, just different kind of primary sources that people can access to learn about this history and kind of see materials from that time period. And in addition to that, we have a big online encyclopedia. Our content director hates it when I say this, but it's basically like the Wikipedia for Japanese American history. It's a lot more in-depth, and it's not just random people on the internet editing it, but it is really extensive. We have over 1,000 articles related to Japanese American history. So I'll be covering some of this in my talk today, but if you want to learn more, I highly recommend going to densho.org. We have a lot there. So, before I kind of dive into the history, I want to just really quickly talk about the terminology that you're going to be hearing me use through this presentation. So Kurt kind of this morning had a line in his performance about leaving internment camps in the past, and kind of leaving that phrase in the past. So the reason for that, the reason why some folks are kind of moving away from using that term, is it actually is a euphemism when you're talking about the broader history of Japanese Americans during World War II. So internment is actually kind of a narrow term that it refers to a process that is legal but kind of morally questionable, where foreign nationals, people who are citizens of a country that the US is at war with, are rounded up and detained. So there was actually internment of Japanese Americans and Japanese immigrants during World War II, but because when you look at the broader Japanese American population at that time, over 2/3 of the people who were incarcerated, were sent to camps, were US citizens. They were born in this country. Many of them had never even been to Japan. So when you're talking about, just as a whole, what happened to Japanese Americans during World War II, it's more accurate to call that incarceration, because we're talking about both immigrants and a really large number of citizens. The other term that I want to just kind of briefly call attention to is concentration camps. So this one actually, if you follow the news or Representative Ocasio-Cortez's Instagram, you may have seen this term, kind of some debate around this and around whether the detention centers for migrant children and families right now, whether that counts as a concentration camp. And I think there's still kind of similar debate around whether the camps where Japanese Americans were held during World War II are concentration camps. And I think a lot of that is because for most of us that term kind of immediately conjures up the Holocaust and the experiences of Jews in Europe and the death camps that the Nazis set up there. So those were concentration camps also. I think those are obviously the most infamous and probably the most egregious example. There are a lot of other historical examples, both in the US, in South Africa, in the Philippines. It's not something that is just one unique period of history. So what a concentration camp is a place where the government or the military or some body in power rounds up a very targeted, vulnerable minority group and detains them based on their identity. So sometimes that escalates to the point of death camps and forced labor camps like we saw with the Holocaust. Sometimes it looks like what happens to Japanese Americans. So that's just kind of a little side note there. But yeah, so I'll kind of get into the history now, but also before I do that, I just want to say, if folks have any questions along the way, I feel like I'm a little bit removed from you all up on the stage, but I would love for this to be, a conversation. So if you have any questions, feel free to, raise your hand or shout them out. I'm happy to kind of pause and answer questions along the way. All right. So I said the first question that I was going to answer was, what happened to Japanese Americans? That was kind of a lie, because to answer that question, you really have to go a lot further back. You have to look at the decades of discrimination, anti-Japanese legislation that sort of paved the way to what happened during World War II. It didn't happen overnight, so we have to go really back to the beginning. So some of you might be familiar with this term, yellow peril. And this is, I'll read this quote out in a minute here, but you can sort of see from this quote and get an idea of what it means. And so this was really almost from the moment the Japanese immigrants started arriving in this country. There was this really strong sentiment that Japanese Americans do not belong here. They're not to be trusted, they're not welcome here. And this yellow peril was not just to Japanese Americans, but also all Asian immigrants and Asian Americans. But this idea that Asian immigrants were coming to this country to kind of take over, to steal jobs away from white people and kind of create another Asian colony in the United States. So this image here, this is kind of a popular image in sort of the early 20th century. And so you can see this kind of, weird little yellow Optimus man. If you look at where his head is, you can kind of see that he is starting out from where Japan would be, and his tentacles are stretching out and reaching out towards Europe and the US. There's this idea, this kind of warning, I guess, that's embedded in that. It's watch out, the Asians are coming for you. So this quote here, this was from a prominent newspaper owner in California, B.S. McClatchy, who's the owner of the Sacramento Bee, who was also one of the leaders of the anti-Japanese exclusion movement that formed kind of in response to increasing immigration from Japan. So I'll read this quote out for you. It says, "They come here specifically and professedly for the purpose of colonizing and establishing here permanently the proud Yamato race. They never cease being Japanese." So there's this idea that Japanese Americans, no matter how long they've been in this country, no matter how many generations they've been in this country, they are always more Japanese than they are American. And so that idea you see also in the media at the time. So these are actual headlines from the Seattle Times from around kind of the early 1900s, 1910s. And again, you see this kind of fear-mongering, right? Where you have these Japanese tidal waves. They're kind of conjuring, sort of this invading army, or you see a lot of headlines about tiny brown men pouring in over the coast, and things like the kind of warnings, right? Japanese Americans are they're bringing disease, they're coming here to threaten American women, which is always sort of coded as white American women, right? So there's a lot going on there. There's a lot of, it's kind of, there's these racial stereotypes, there's sexual stereotypes. It all kind of snowballs together and sort of helps push forward this idea that then, leads to the discrimination that you see leading up to World War II, and then that escalates into incarceration. So this is, I have to excuse my very basic, non-existent graphic design skills, but I wanted to show just kind of a basic timeline of Japanese American history kind of leading up to the war, and sort of the history of discrimination and this kind of anti-Japanese movement that I mentioned. So really, you see, like, from the very beginning, like, what kind of precipitated Japanese immigration to the US in big numbers was the Chinese Exclusion Act. Because prior to that, the railroads and the logging industry, these businesses that were sort of recruiting Chinese laborers, once Chinese immigration was cut off, they started reaching out to Japan to recruit laborers. And so you see that same cycle of Asian exclusion sort of start to repeat with this new target of Japanese Americans. And again, you can see almost, from the beginning. It's cut off a little bit, sorry. But you see, that kind of sentiment, that attitude and like stereotypes towards Japanese Americans sort of materializes into these real consequences that impact people's lives. So you see things like laws at the state and the territorial level that ban Japanese immigrants from owning land. You see bans on interracial marriage. You see some school districts creating segregated schools so that Japanese children cannot go to school with white children. At the same time, the government is starting to conduct surveillance on Japanese Americans. And so as early as 1917, the FBI is already keeping an eye on Japanese labor activists in Hawaii because they're worried that these people are subversives and they're trying to overthrow the government. So then kind of through the 1920s, 1930s, that surveillance increases. And at the same time, at the legislative level, Congress is passing laws that restrict immigration from Japan, from other countries in Asia. So you get to this point where immigration is completely cut off, and then in 1940, like a full year before the war started, before the US enters the war, the government already has these massive lists of names of people, Japanese immigrants and Japanese Americans who they suspect of being spies for Japan. So by the time we actually get to World War II, all of this is already in place. So it's very easy for the government to kind of take that next step to kind of weaponize these decades of anti-Japanese and anti-Asian sentiment and legislation and all of this kind of agitating. So I wanted to share and kind of get into the history of what actually happened during World War II in a minute here, but I wanted to share a couple of things from our archives that I think sort of illustrate this point in a way that I can't just sitting here talking at you. So this quote, this is from a LA Times editorial that ran a few weeks after Pearl Harbor and about 2 weeks before the executive order that authorized the incarceration. So this is like a major newspaper printed this on their editorial page saying, "A viper is nonetheless a viper wherever the egg is hatched. So a Japanese American born of Japanese parents grows up to be a Japanese, not an American." And I think this quote is really striking. Obviously this quote over here, this didn't run in that editorial. This is a Dorothea Lange photo from the forced removal. But when you see, I think, like this language kind of paired with who it's directed at, right? Because what they're saying is that Japanese American children, people who were born in this country, who have no real connection to Japan other than their heritage, like these two little girls, you have a major American newspaper calling them snakes, basically calling them vermin. And this is not unique. You saw this in a lot of media outlets, in a lot of newspapers, where that sentiment existed before Pearl Harbor, but it was kind of unleashed after that, where all of a sudden there was this like intense anti-Japanese sentiment that was kind of targeted toward men, women, children, people of any age. So the other thing that I wanted to show you, and actually I have to pull this up on YouTube because this is not my computer and the video didn't come through. But do folks recognize who this is? Yeah, Aki. So yeah, Aki Hirose was a beloved school teacher in Seattle, but before that, she was a teenager in Seattle who was removed with her family to Minidoka. So this clip here that I'm going to play for you, this is her describing going back to school the day after Pearl Harbor.
Well, I just come home from church, and then we kept hearing Pearl Harbor was bombed, Pearl Harbor was bombed. I had no idea what Pearl Harbor was. My geography was not that sophisticated. I had no idea, and my father said, oh, there's going to be trouble. And I said, well, how come? He said, well, Japan just bombed Pearl Harbor. And it's just, we're at war with Japan. But I thought, why should it bother me? I'm American. And then he said, we are aliens. My parents, we don't have the citizenship. So they're going to do something, will probably get taken away. But at that time, my parents had no feeling that we would be removed so they were saying my brother would have to take on the responsibility to keep the family together because they may be removed or put into camp or whatever. And then when I went back to school that following morning, December 8th, one of the teachers said, you people bombed Pearl Harbor. People, all of a sudden, my Japanese-ness became very aware to me, and then that I no longer felt I'm an equal American, but I felt kind of threatened and nervous about it.
Okay, so yeah, I like to show that clip because I think it really helps to have that kind of personal perspective, like what that experience was like being Japanese American in this country the day after Pearl Harbor, kind of like as all of this was unfolding. And so I think kind of like that quote from the LA Times, it again just kind of shows you how people who were born in this country, who had lived their entire lives as an American, were suddenly not viewed that way, or it's kind of more sort of on the surface. What had been kind of simmering under the surface for a long time was now just really obvious and in your face that like you don't belong here, like you are not included. So this is kind of what then like sets the stage for the incarceration. So you have kind of these decades of discrimination that lead up to it, and then this kind of like dehumanizing, sort of othering of the Japanese American community. So, what happened to Japanese Americans during World War II? We kind of talked about what led up to that. The first thing that happened, so usually when people think about World War II incarceration, we think about the camps like Minidoka and Manzanar and Tule Lake, those kind of big camps where most people spent the majority of the war. What is less known is that there was also, I kind of mentioned at the beginning of this, like the internment system, where the Issei, the immigrant generation, was detained. And so actually before that mass removal of the entire Japanese American community, there were these mass arrests of Japanese community leaders. So, I mentioned that kind of government surveillance of Japanese Americans that happened sort of in the decades leading up to World War II. Because the government had been, collecting names of people that they considered suspicious, they considered spies, they were actually able to start picking people up within a few hours of Pearl Harbor. So on December 7th, 1941, the FBI and local police start knocking on doors and arresting people. And so these are mostly Issei men. A lot of them are Buddhist priests or, Gakuen instructors, Japanese language school instructors, people who are kind of prominent in their community. And so really the reason why they are suspect by the government is because they're community leaders. And so within just the first 48 hours, over 1,200 people are taken into government custody. The vast majority of these people are arrested without any warrants, without any formal charges. Their families are not told where they are going or how long they will be detained for. And a lot of these families they're not informed of where these men are being taken until after they've already been transferred to detention centers that are run by the Army or the Department of Justice. So these families are actually separated in a lot of cases for 2 or 3 years. So this is a really traumatic thing. If you can kind of imagine being like a child, and all of a sudden, one day your dad is here, and then the next day the government comes and takes him away, and you don't see him for a couple of years. Or I also think about my great grandfather was one of these men who was arrested, and for me, I think about my great grandma. And what it would have been like for her to, all of a sudden, you have these 6 kids that you have to take care of and find a way to keep going, and you have no idea where your husband is, if he's coming back. So like this period is, there's a lot of fear in the community, and I think that's kind of the intention, right, is to sort of put people on notice that you are being watched and you are not included in this country. And so this is, I'm going to show just kind of an image here. So this is an actual arrest record of an Issei man who was arrested in Hawaii from Honolulu. And so you can see here that he was actually arrested. Well, you may be able to see it's a little small, but so he was arrested kind of late February 1942. So I mentioned kind of those first 48 hours, about 1,200 people are taken into custody, but those arrests continue over the next few months, like few weeks and months. And so eventually, all told, you end up with about like 8,000 to 9,000 people who are taken into government custody, who are arrested by the FBI. So those mass arrests are kind of the prelude to the mass removal. It's kind of a practice run, I guess, in some ways you could call it. So the mass removal, this is what most people are more familiar with. This is when like all those photos that you may have seen of the children wearing the tags and the people with the suitcases. That's the mass removal. So February 19th, 1942, the president signs an executive order that authorizes the removal of, it doesn't say Japanese Americans, it doesn't mention them by name, it's just sort of understood that this applies to Japanese Americans. But because they know that it's unconstitutional to target a specific group for removal, they sort of code it. They say any or all persons can be removed from military zones that have been designated kind of high security areas. So the executive order authorizes the military to create those zones and then exclude people from them. And then over kind of the spring and summer of 1942, over 110,000 Japanese Americans on the West Coast are removed kind of by a series of exclusion orders. So if you've seen, I should have put a photo of this, but if you've seen those kind of pictures of the posted notices, the like notice to persons of Japanese ancestry on the telephone poles, those were the exclusion orders. So you would see those kind of carried out by city or by county as people were removed. And so this one, I wanted to again just kind of show you the way that this was portrayed by the media, and also kind of, I think, juxtapose that with some of the actual images from this. So this quote, this is from the Seattle Times coverage of the removal of Japanese Americans from Bainbridge Island. So Bainbridge Island was actually the first community to be removed and sent to a concentration camp. This was exclusion order number 1. So the Seattle Times, in their reporting, the headline for this article, by the way, is "Tears and Smiles Mingle as Japs Bid Bainbridge Farewell." So keep that in mind. But the quote, I'm going to pull here, is going to say, "The evacuation was a credit to the efficiency of the Army." And so you see a couple things there. You see, one, they're calling this an evacuation, which sort of implies that they're being removed from for their own protection. This is kind of what you would hear if people were being evacuated from like a natural disaster or something. So it's sort of hiding the fact that this is a forced removal that is very much a militarized action. So this quote describes it as a credit to the Army, but you can see in these photos that, this really is not a place where the military should be. This is not what, this is not a war zone. These people are not criminals, but you can see here, so this image on the right, this is an elderly woman from Bainbridge Island. She actually had a heart attack during the removal and had to be escorted onto the ferry by these 2 soldiers. And then over on the left here, you can see this little boy, this little toddler next to a soldier with a gun and a bayonet. And so I think, for both of these images, you can kind of see how, the newspapers and politicians and the Army and all of these people kind of justified it as, Japanese Americans are a threat and they're dangerous. But really what we're talking about here in many cases is like children and elders and people who are not a threat in any way, shape, or form. So I wanted to kind of briefly go through the kind of different kinds of camps. So I'm going to just kind of talk about the 3 main kinds of camps. There were some other sort of like smaller facilities where kind of the troublemakers, people who resisted were sent. But mainly what we have is the internment camps, prison camps that were run by the Department of Justice and the Army. And so this is where those Issei and also some Kibe who were arrested by the FBI following Pearl Harbor. This is where most of them ended up. So these were run kind of like prisoner of war camps, and they were specifically for immigrants who had been deemed enemy aliens. So they were sort of suspected spies, and this was actually separate from the main system of camps where people who ended up in places like Minidoka were incarcerated. So for that bigger group, the people who were removed en masse, the assembly centers, and I put that in quotes because, obviously this assembly was kind of forced at gunpoint, so this was not like a pep assembly. But these were kind of the temporary detention camps where people were held right after being removed. Because places like Minidoka and Manzanar were not finished yet. The government was still constructing them, but they said that Japanese Americans were such an urgent threat that we have to get them off the coast right away. And so what they did in most cases is they actually repurposed places like the Puyallup Fairgrounds, horse racing tracks, places like that they just kind of turned into these sort of makeshift, temporary facilities where people would be held while the bigger camps were being constructed. The conditions in these places was generally very poor. It was really unsanitary, overcrowded. In some of these places, people were actually housed in former horse stalls. You can see this photo on the left here, Tanforan in California. That was one of the camps where people were held, like they lived in horse stalls, and people, who were there, they'll tell you, like, we could smell the horses that used to be here. That, they just kind of like paved, kind of, sort of cleaned them out and then paved over. But because this was happening, over the summer, a lot of these places, especially like in Southern California, like it was hot. And so on really hot days, that asphalt would kind of start to melt a little bit. And so people, would say that we would, some of it would like come up and get stuck on, the furniture or on, their shoes, and just, create fumes that would make people sick. And then this photo on the right here, this is what was called Camp Harmony, but the Puyallup Fairgrounds, the prison camp at Puyallup. So this was actually, people who eventually ended up in Minidoka. That was their first stop, was Puyallup. And then for most people, their kind of final stop was one of the War Relocation Authority concentration camps. So the War Relocation Authority, or the WRA, was kind of the government body that managed these camps. And these were intended to be kind of more permanent sites, not forever, but just kind of, for the duration, where people were intended to stay like during the war. These were a lot more isolated than the assembly centers. Most of the assembly centers were kind of closer to where people were removed from. If you kind of think like Seattle to Puyallup, that's not that far. But, Minidoka, Idaho, or Hunt, Idaho, that's pretty far out. So these places were sited in areas that were very removed, so they were kind of outside of the public eye, where there was just a lot of, undeveloped land. A lot of these camps, the government kind of used the labor of Japanese Americans to, put in sort of like irrigation systems or to create kind of agricultural programs. And so, and some of them were also built on tribal land against the objections of the local tribes. So I think it all is kind of, there's a lot of layers to it, but yeah, so basically these were in kind of remote areas in the interior. So this is a map where you can see all of the detention sites where Japanese Americans were held. And so, again, I think people are really, or, most people are kind of familiar with those 10 WRA concentration camps. There actually were over 70 different sites where Japanese Americans were held during World War II. And you can see it actually is a lot more spread out, too. Like, I think, when I first started learning about this and first saw this map for the first time, it's kind of surprising when you look at it and you see, like Louisiana and like New Jersey and, places that we don't, even Alaska, places that you wouldn't necessarily expect. But yeah, I think it just, again, like this, it was a bigger system than, we're usually told about in school, like if we learn about this in school at all. All right. So those were the facilities where people were held, kind of the main ones. So I wanted to, just kind of talk about kind of what happened inside those camps. So after the removal, after people were put into these camps, I think the next kind of big chapter in the incarceration history is kind of the segregation of people who the government deemed disloyal. Now, are folks familiar with the loyalty questionnaire? Yeah. So if you're not familiar, just briefly, the loyalty questionnaire was kind of an attempt by the government to test the loyalty of Japanese Americans that they had incarcerated. And the government was kind of realizing that, it's not sustainable for us to hold all of these people forever, and also we don't want them to, become dependent on the government, because we know how the government doesn't like to, pay welfare to people who need it. But so what they tried to do is kind of determine, okay, who are the loyal Americans who are in here, and let's encourage them to leave the camps, to go east, go to school or go find jobs, and kind of spread out and assimilate, so that we don't have these, Japan towns, these kind of ethnic enclaves anymore. So what they did is in January 1943, the WRA distributed what they called a registration form within all 10 camps. And so this was something that everyone over 17 was required to complete. And most of the questions were things that were kind of designed to test, like, how Americanized are you? How assimilated are you? So they would ask things like, what magazines do you subscribe to? Or, do you play baseball or do you do judo? How, are you fluent in Japanese? Are you in the Boy Scouts, or, are you part of the Kenjinkai? Things like that. But there were two questions, the last two questions, that were really contentious and created a lot of fear and a lot of confusion. So one of those questions asked if people would be willing to serve in the military. And so for a lot of people, there was one kind of fear that, like, if I say yes to this, does that mean that I'm enlisting? Because I'm not sure that I want to do that. And then two, sorry, I lost my train of thought there. And two, also just like anger, like, you put me in this camp, you took away my rights, you're incarcerating my parents and my grandparents and my friends, but you're asking me to go out and risk my life for this country. So a lot of people said no to that question, or gave some kind of qualified answer, like, yes, I will serve in the military if you let me out of here, or if you let my family out of here. The other question that caused a lot of contention asked people to renounce their allegiance to the Emperor of Japan. And so this was problematic for a lot of reasons, but basically, again, it's kind of insulting, especially for the Nisei, who were born in this country, who have never had any allegiance to the Emperor. Also, I think a lot of people were afraid that it was kind of a trick question, that, if I say yes, I'm renouncing my allegiance to the Emperor, am I admitting that I was at one time loyal to Japan? And then for the Issei, it was extra problematic because they were prohibited from becoming U.S. citizens, so their only citizenship was Japanese citizenship. And so there were a lot of fears that if they, disavowed the Japanese emperor, that they might lose their Japanese citizenship and become stateless persons. So in all, 70%, almost 1 out of 5 people said no to these questions or gave some kind of qualified answer. And so the government took that and labeled all of those people disloyal. So in the spring of 1943, the government kind of rebrands Tule Lake as maximum security segregation center. They add more watchtowers, they bring in some tanks and more soldiers, and it becomes this really militarized place, even more so than the other camps. And about 12,000 people, people who kind of failed this loyalty question, and then also their children were transferred to Tule Lake. And I'm just going to kind of like briefly cover on this. There's obviously a lot more to this, so you could dig a little deeper. But there was just like this big effort to kind of segregate out the loyal from the disloyal. The other kind of example of people within these camps sort of pushing back against the government's actions, kind of contrary to that usual narrative that we hear about Japanese Americans sort of quietly going along with this. There were actually people who pushed back. And so another big example of that is around the draft. So right after Pearl Harbor, the government reclassified Nisei as ineligible for military service. But by February of 1944, the war had been going for a couple of years. The military situation was kind of getting a little rougher. They needed more recruits. So like, okay, maybe now, we can start recruiting Japanese Americans. So they reclassified Nisei men to make them eligible for military service and reinstate the draft within these concentration camps. Now most people go along with it. When they receive their draft orders, they just they comply. They go along. And some people actually volunteer. Like at the closing ceremony on Monday, you'll actually see the honor roll of people from Minidoka who served in the military. But a lot of people also did not want to serve. So there were about 300 young men who refused to go along. They received their draft orders, but they were like, what? No, like you put me in this place, I'm not gonna risk my life for this country. And ultimately, the government prosecuted them, and they were removed from the camps and sent on to prisons because they were sentenced to federal prison sentences for draft evasion. So that's kind of there's obviously is a lot more to that story, but I think I wanted to kind of just take you through sort of the main events, I guess, and just the kind of like this removal process and what preceded that, and then kind of the camps that people were sent to. So after the camps start to close, this is January 1945 when the president reopens the West Coast to Japanese Americans. You'll notice that is after the November 1944 elections. FDR waited until after he'd secured re-election to make this announcement, not wanting to appear soft on the Japanese problem. So starting in kind of early 1945, the camps start to shut down. And so people are ordered to leave. This is not optional. In some cases, people are actually forced to leave because, really this is another eviction. And it sounds a little ironic, and, it is ironic that, people who were imprisoned, some of them actually wanted to stay because they'd lived in these places for 3 years, and especially for, like elderly folks and for people with young children, that move was really arduous. And a lot of people were not happy about it. But they were required to leave. And so what they were given upon being released was $25 and a one-way ticket back to wherever they were removed from 3 years later. So kind of the bare minimum. And a lot of people really had nothing to return to. I mentioned back at the kind of towards the beginning how there were laws that prevented Japanese immigrants from owning their property. So for a lot of the Issei, they didn't own their homes or their businesses before the war. They leased them. And so when they were removed, they lost that. They lost their homes, they lost their businesses, they lost everything that they had built up for a lot of them over a few decades. And so when people started coming back, a lot of them had no place to go. And so they ended up living in these kind of makeshift shelters and hostels that were set up in local churches and schools and kind of community centers. And for people in Minidoka, a lot of them lived in the Japanese language school. And if you're in Seattle, it's kind of like 14th and Main, you probably know it. But they lived in, the nickname for it was Hunt Hostel, because the camp was in Hunt, Idaho. And some people, they'll say that like these hostels were kind of an extension of camp, because the facilities in a lot of ways were kind of similar, where, like there's no privacy, it's overcrowded, and you have families just kind of like sleeping on top of each other. And so it really took people a long time to rebuild. And, again, especially for the Issei, for people who, by the time they were released from the camps were, maybe in like their 60s, 70s, 80s, and all of a sudden are having to go back to work, kind of this second career almost. And the only jobs that generally were available to people were really, hard, like manual labor, things like gardening or housekeeping, things that, when you're 70 years old, like you don't want to be on your knees, like trimming someone's lawn. So there's a lot of just kind of like economic hardship as people were coming back. The other big thing is, people are, there's still a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment at this time. As US soldiers are starting to return and people are hearing more about, kind of what happened in the Pacific Theater in the war and some of these like atrocities committed by the Japanese army, because Japanese Americans are not seen as American, but are seen as Japanese, they are, a lot of the public blames Japanese people for this. There's another interview in our archives with a woman who she describes like getting on a city bus in Seattle after the war, and a woman looked at her, like looked down at her from the window and spit on her. And she was maybe like 8 or 9 years old when this happened, but this woman says, like, you killed my son, and then spit on this little Nisei girl, because people see this Japanese face and equate it with the enemy even after the war. And so you can kind of see here, this photo here, this is in Seattle, and this is what a lot of families return to, is, this, like, there's vandalism, there's graffiti on their property, or, their belongings have been stolen. In some cases, there's even acts of violence, like people firing rifles into Japanese American homes, or setting off dynamite on Japanese American farms. So it's, it's pretty scary, again. So I think just kind of imagining what that was like for people is, the hardship didn't end when the war ended. It really continued and kind of reverberated for a long time. So, this last question, kind of why does this matter today? This one, I think this is almost more of a question that I would pose to you all. I mean, I think everyone in this room probably has different opinions and kind of different thoughts about, why this history is important to you and why, you're here at the pilgrimage this weekend. But we already, have heard like some of the speakers this morning kind of mentioned these sort of parallels and how history, if it doesn't repeat exactly, it kind of rhymes, right? So these photos, these are, about 70, 75 years apart. But we see here, this one on the left, this is a Japanese American child who was on a train ready to take them to the Assembly Center in Tanforan. The one that I showed you that picture earlier where, some of the people lived in horse stalls. So this baby here, you see like en route to a detention center. And then on the left here, this is from last year when we kind of first saw, these like family detention centers really starting to kind of accelerate and grow like on an unprecedented level. So this photo, this is a child who's on a bus taking them from a border patrol station to a family detention center. And I think, it's just interesting when you kind of look at these photos and, they're taken, about 76 years apart, but, it's really the same image in a lot of ways. And so, for us at Densho, a lot of the reason why we do this history and why we think it's so important to share this story is, not only to kind of preserve the history and make sure that people are educated about this, but also to be able to recognize when those patterns are repeated. We have to, the saying kind of goes, right? Like, if you don't know your history, then you're doomed to repeat it. So we can recognize that, there are some serious parallels between what's happening now and what happened, 75, 77 years ago. That is pretty frightening, and maybe this is something that we should be paying attention to. The other thing that we talk a lot about is, so in 1942, as Japanese Americans were being kind of uprooted from their homes, there really wasn't this big public outcry. You saw those news articles, right, where the media was covering this as, a good thing, or just a military efficiency. So this photo, this is, again, the Bainbridge Island folks. So this is in Seattle. These are people being loaded onto the train that's going to take them to Manzanar. But if you look in the background, if you look at that overpass, kind of over the train, you can see that there is a big crowd of people just watching. So people came to watch Japanese Americans being taken away. And this is not to say like there probably are people in that crowd who were sympathetic and maybe, wanted to say goodbye. But mainly what we see is people just silently watching this happen and not doing anything. So like another thing that we kind of say a lot at Densho, and I think also I see a lot of other folks in the community increasingly saying this too, is that Japanese Americans can be the allies that our community didn't have in 1942. So when we think about, not just these detention camps where, the migrant children and families are being held, but also, there's the Muslim ban, and there's kind of this like general rhetoric around immigration and kind of dehumanizing people who are coming to this country to seek a better life. A lot of that rings very familiar. And so I think just to kind of to close, I think something to sort of, carry forward is to really think, like how can we be allies that we didn't have in 1942? Like knowing all of this history, being able to recognize, okay, so, the dehumanizing language that we're seeing in newspapers now to describe immigrants, that sounds very familiar to the language that was used against Japanese immigrants in kind of the 1920s and 1930s. So if we recognize this path that we're headed on, let's reroute that. Let's take a different path this time around. Yeah, I think that's pretty much all that I wanted to say. I do actually want to point out, so this image on the top left, this actually is, some of you might recognize, this is actually from last year's Minidoka pilgrimage. So you can see some of last year's student scholars, Yoko and Hana, are in this photo carrying the banner. In front here, that's Tani Ikeda, that's Tom Ikeda's daughter. I think, is Marissa out here too? Yeah, she's in this photo. But yeah, so I think just, all of these photos, so the one with Satsuki and Kiyoshi Ina on the top right there, that was from last year's Tule Lake pilgrimage. This one on the bottom is from the Crystal City pilgrimage that happened earlier this year. And this other one was from when the Muslim ban was first announced and people kind of went to the airports to protest. But yeah, I just wanted to kind of share these because I think it is really powerful to see how Japanese Americans are really kind of engaging that history, and rather than just kind of preserving it somewhere in an archive where It just is kind of enacted and it sits there. People are really bringing that out of the archive and doing something really powerful with it. Yeah, so I'll end there, but does anybody have any questions?
So, I was just curious, that 45 when the West Coast was reopened, that $25 was given. But I didn't understand whether that was per family or per person. $25 in 1940 was talking about $1,000 in today's money. So I was just wondering.
Yeah, I believe, and actually, I mean, Dr. Kashma might know this more than I do, but I believe it was kind of per adult, or I'm not 100% on whether that was per family or per individual. And I think that, yes, like $25 in 1945 was a lot more than it is today. But I think, for any of us, if you think about having to restart your life with nothing but $1,000, even that is not very much. That's, maybe, you can pay like a month or two of rent with that. Or maybe you can pay, rent plus, food for your kids for 1 month, but it doesn't give you a lot. And especially, I think, when you think about, people were imprisoned for over 3 years. And, to walk away with that, with something that doesn't really, it's not really equal, I think, to what was taken away. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so American Public Media did a great podcast series last year, I believe. It's called Order 9066. So I would definitely recommend that. Actually ended up using a lot of like Densho kind of oral history clips, and so you can hear people kind of talking about that in their own words, which I think is always really impactful. So it's kind of I feel like a podcast that comes immediately to mind. I also think, not to be self-serving and plug my own org, but really I think the oral histories in the archives, and not just at Densho, there's other orgs that have collected oral histories as well. But yeah, I think really like listening to the people who experienced incarceration, they can describe that in ways that I never can. So I would recommend listening to the people who experienced it. So the announcement was made in January 1945 that the West Coast was reopened. So people could start leaving the camps and go back to the West Coast starting at that point. By 1945, a lot of people had already left to kind of relocate to like the Midwest or the East Coast. Because the government also encouraged people to, especially in Nisei, people who they could kind of hold up as sort of ambassadors of goodwill were encouraged to go to schools or go get jobs kind of outside the camps in other parts of the country. The camps started to close kind of gradually over 1945. I think it was sort of not all of the camps closed at the same time. So it was kind of just as people started leaving, and once they got down to kind of a certain amount of people, they would just shut them down, or they would kind of set a date and say, everybody has to be out by this time. But they just, kind of financially, they didn't really want want to keep supporting the camps, but also, it wasn't a military necessity to open the camps in the first place. And so by the time you get to 1944 or 1945, it is especially unnecessary to keep people incarcerated. Did you have a question?
Yes, and just a point of information, I had two grandfathers that were in Santa Fe, but like the rest of the families were in Minidoka. But when they closed down Santa Fe, they wouldn't release one of my grandfathers until May of 1946.
Yeah, no, thank you for bringing it up, because you're right. Some of the camps did remain open past the end of the war. So Crystal City, which it sounds like maybe where your dad ended up, was kind of the family reunification camp where people who were in those DOJ and Army camps were reunited with their families. So that camp stayed open into 1946. Tule Lake also was open through 1946 as well, because they were holding people who were going to be deported to Japan. So there really is like a lot more to this history that I would love to tell you if we had more time. But yeah, this was kind of just the basics.
Oh, okay. So like in the presentation, you kind of go into how like words have power and how the government would use certain language to control the narrative. And I'm noticing that there's a lot of kind of like a retaking of words and calling it concentration camps now and stuff like that. And I think that that's, do you think that like in schools, when learning about these concentration camps, do you think that they should start calling them concentration camps? Do you think like the education around it should change and like the words and the language used?
I do, yes. I mean, I am not in charge of any school policy anywhere, but yeah, I mean, I personally believe, as you said, that like words have power, and I don't think we do ourselves any favors. I don't think we do like future generations any favors by kind of like soft coding that, and calling it something that it wasn't. So I think, I would argue that yeah, we should be, teaching children what really happened, and that includes the terminology. Okay, maybe two more.
Well, I am sorry that our time is expiring without more talk about what we're facing right now, today, every day on the borders. What I would like to be hearing more from people about maybe new ideas and how we can express our disapproval of the way things are going on the borders when we have such an obstructive Congress that they can't seem to hope to get anything done there. And I'd also like to mention that in Hawaii, during the internment time of the Japanese, the police chief that was white came and stopped some of it and being held. And of course it was John Burns, and they managed to prevent a bunch of incarceration by white people fighting for them. But here in the mainland, that the arena is so huge. I just feel helpless and all for us to do stuff that I feel like we should be doing.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I think it's it's important for people to act, and I think like obviously there is a lot more that needs to be done. I think like education and kind of knowing what we're facing and knowing where we've been is a good place to start. But I think we already mentioned, or Stephen mentioned earlier, like there is going to be kind of a solidarity action during the lunch break. We can kind of learn a little more about ways that you can help. I know that there's the petition that Carrie is kind of circulating, and the youth, the student scholars are working on something else that I think we'll share during that action. So let's say stay tuned. And I really quick, sorry.
My question is, so I've heard a lot about
Yeah, so the question was about if there were any deaths in the camps from mistreatment. And the answer is yes. I mean, I don't know an exact number of people who died from not having access to maybe like the quality health care that they needed. I mean, there were women who died in childbirth who probably wouldn't have if they had access to better hospitals or other kind of things like that that have to do with the healthcare. There were 7 people who were killed by camp guards in the camps. There were 2 who were killed during the Manzanar riot. There were other people who were killed in kind of the Department of Justice camps. There was like an elderly man in Topaz, I believe, who was killed by a guard. There was a young man in Tule Lake who was killed during a verbal altercation with a guard. And that one always sticks with me because the guard, in that case, none of the guards were ever accountable for these shootings, but the one in Tule Lake, I think in particular always sits with me because the guard was court-martialed and ultimately acquitted, but he was fined $1 for the cost of the bullet that was fired because it was judged a misuse of government property. So there were deaths in the camps. I don't know specific numbers about the kind of deaths resulting from mistreatment or withholding of medical treatment, but there were 7 people who were shot and killed by camp guards. So yeah, thank you everyone. I think we've got to get ready for the next presentation.